The Hundred Years' War was not born in a day. It erupted like a storm gathering over decades, and when it finally broke in 1337, it would rage, on and off, for 116 years, leaving scars across the landscape of Europe and branding itself into the memory of history. It began not with a single sword drawn in anger, but with a crown left vacant, a throne left trembling in uncertainty. When King Charles IV of France died without a male heir, the kingdom found itself teetering on the edge of chaos. And in that silence, before the first cry of war, stood two rivals, each cloaked in bloodlines, ambition, and destiny. Edward III of England, grandson of the late French King Philip IV, believed that the crown of France was rightfully his. But the French nobility turned their gaze elsewhere. They chose Philip VI of Valois, a cousin of Charles, sparking a dispute that would stretch beyond lifetimes and carve itself into legend. But this was more than a dynastic spat. It was a collision of empires in the making. The battle lines weren't just drawn over royal titles, they were etched into gold, grain, and land. Regions like Flanders and Aquitaine, rich, vital, pulsing with trade and power, became prizes in a high-stakes game where pride and profit danced together in blood-soaked rhythm. Beneath the banners of lions and fleur-de-lis, warriors fought not only for their kings, but for the future of their people. And yet the war was anything but constant. It ebbed and flowed like a wounded tide, one moment roaring with the thunder of cavalry and arrows, the next retreating into uneasy silence with fragile truces and broken promises. Each lull in the fighting wasn't peace, it was simply the breath before another blow. This wasn't a simple feud, it was theater, politics, betrayal, and survival. It was the echo of ancient claims and the desperation of new realities. It was a war that aged generations, devoured kingdoms, and reshaped Europe's map through whispers and fire. And at its heart pulsed a question that refused to die. Who had the right to wear the crown of France? The war would ask, again and again, in fields from Crécy to Agincourt, from sieges to parliaments, in the voices of kings and the cries of peasants, echoing through time with each drop of royal blood spilled. The 100 Years' War had begun, and there would be no turning back. The 100 Years' War was not a single, relentless charge. It was a symphony of chaos, played in three distinct movements, each with its own tempo, its own heroes, and its own tides of hope and despair. The first act, known as the Edwardian War, 1337-1360, struck like a thunderclap. England, under Edward III, charged into France with a fury forged in ambition and steel. It was here that the English longbow carved its name into legend, cutting down knights with the whistling whisper of arrows. Battles like Crécy and Poitiers were not just victories, they were spectacles of tactical genius, where smaller English forces outmaneuvered and outshot the proud French armies. At Poitiers, even the King of France, Jean VI, was taken prisoner, a living trophy paraded across enemy lines. In these early days, the English roared across French soil, their banners gleaming and their confidence unshaken. But wars are not won in single strides. Then came the second phase, the Caroline War, 1369 to 1389, a reversal as poetic as it was brutal. France, bleeding but unbroken, rose again under the cunning leadership of King Charles V. With the steel resolve of Bertrand du Guesclin at his side, a commander as relentless as the plague and as clever as the devil, France began to reclaim its stolen breath. They didn't chase glory in grand battles. No, they fought with patience, with sieges, with strategy. Town by town, fortress by fortress, the French took back what had been lost. The English, once dominant, now found themselves holding slippery ground, their victories fading like mist in morning sun. The pendulum had swung, and with each recaptured city, France whispered to the world, "We are not done yet." And then, the final act, the Lancastrian War, 1410 to 1453, a crescendo of clashing steel and shattered illusions. It began with a scream of English triumph, as Henry V led his forces to an overwhelming victory at Agincourt in 1415. There, in the mud and blood, English archers again shattered the pride of French chivalry. But fate, ever fickle, had not chosen its side just yet. Into this maelstrom stepped a figure unlike any other, a peasant girl claiming visions from God, clad in courage rather than armor, Joan of Arc. Her presence was a spark in dry fields. She lifted sieges, shattered doubt, and breathed life into the weary spirit of France. Her martyrdom would cement her legend, but it was her defiance that turned the tide. And as the war reached its dying breaths, it was the French who stood victorious. Not through overwhelming force, but through resilience, reinvention, and the unbreakable will to reclaim their destiny. Each phase of this long, bloody saga rewrote the rules of war. Tactics evolved, alliances shifted like sand in storm winds, and the morale of men rose and fell with the pulse of kings and the courage of commoners. This was no mere war. It was a century-long crucible that reshaped nations, forged legends, and asked again and again, who would control the fate of France? When the dust of the 100 Years' War finally settled, it didn't leave behind mere ruins and graveyards. It left behind new worlds, reborn from the ashes of old empires. France, once fractured and fragile, had emerged not only victorious, but transformed. Through fire and siege, through famine and fear, something unexpected had taken root: identity. A sense of nationhood, no longer tethered solely to lords and bloodlines, but to a shared struggle, to the land itself, to the idea of France. The chaos of war, paradoxically, had birthed order. The monarchy, once competing with feudal lords for influence, now found its authority expanding. The kings of France, having weathered the storm, stood taller, no longer just rulers by name, but central pillars of a unified state. It was in the ruins of battlefields like Orléans and Patay that the modern French nation began to find its voice, singing not just of victory, but of belonging. But across the Channel, England sang a different tune, one of unrest, uncertainty, and shadows gathering. The war, once a symbol of imperial ambition, had drained the coffers, exhausted the people, and fractured the crown. The echoes of defeat at Castillon and the loss of ancestral French lands rang louder than any herald's trumpet. The proud victories of Crécy and Agincourt now seemed like ancient dreams, and in their place rose questions that clawed at the heart of English nobility. Why had so much been lost? Who had failed the kingdom? The answers came not in proclamations, but in swords drawn within England's own borders. Discontent festered into rebellion, and the War of the Roses, a brutal civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, erupted, plunging the kingdom into a new nightmare, where the enemy wore the same colors and spoke the same tongue. Yet beyond crowns and corpses, the 100 Years' War altered the very nature of warfare. No longer would glory ride solely on the shoulders of knights clad in shimmering steel. The age of the mounted elite, the heavy cavalry, was crumbling beneath the weight of change. In its place, gunpowder began to speak. Cannons thundered at castle walls. Arquebuses shattered the silence once dominated by swords. The battlefield was becoming a different creature, less about chivalric duels and more about strategy, firepower, and formations. What had once been medieval was now evolving, forging the path toward the Renaissance, the modern state, and the professional army. The 100 Years' War, with all its blood and brutality, was not just an end, it was a beginning. She came not from a palace, nor from a lineage of nobles or knights. She rode not for glory, but for conviction. Her voice, she claimed, was heaven's own. In a war dominated by kings and seasoned commanders, Joan of Arc appeared like a prophecy wrapped in armor, a flicker of divine defiance in a land drowning in despair. France by then was bleeding, its morale shattered, its cause flickering like a candle in the wind. Then came a girl from Domremy, a mere teenager, untrained in war, unheard in politics, but aflame with purpose. With nothing but faith and fire in her eyes, she demanded an audience with the Dauphin and promised victory where generals had failed. Skepticism shadowed her every step, but Joan did not ask for belief, she commanded it. And when she rode to Orléans, clad in white armor and wielding not just a sword, but a symbol, the impossible happened. The siege was broken, and hope returned. That victory was more than military, it was spiritual. It wasn't just a city that was liberated, it was the French spirit itself. Soldiers who had long fought with wearied hearts now marched with renewed vigor, following a girl who had no rank but commanded the loyalty of thousands. Joan's presence transformed the battlefield into a stage of legend. With her at the front, the French reclaimed more than land. They reclaimed belief in their cause. Her courage wasn't reckless, it was radiant. But destiny, as always, is laced with thorns. Betrayal came not from a blade, but from silence. Captured by the Burgundians and handed to the English, Joan faced not an enemy in war, but a court built to crush her soul. They called her a heretic, a witch, a liar. But in truth, they feared her power, not her sword, but what she represented, a united France, rising. She was burned, yes, but the flames did not consume her memory. They lit a fire across generations. Joan died in 1431, but her legend only grew louder with time. To the French people, she became more than a martyr. She became the soul of resistance, the embodiment of defiance against tyranny. Her trial, once meant to erase her, was later annulled, her name cleared, her legacy sanctified. And centuries later, the church that once remained silent canonized her, naming her Saint Joan of Arc. Not merely a figure of faith, but a cornerstone of French identity. Her life carved into stone, her image painted in cathedrals, her story etched into the very foundation of a nation reborn from war. The final breath of the 100 Years' War came not with the roar of drums or the cry of kings, but with a quiet, resolute shift in the balance of power. By 1453, the once fragmented Kingdom of France stood nearly whole again. City by city, field by field, it had pulled itself from the brink and reclaimed its lands, its pride, and its place in the world. The English strongholds on French soil, once numerous and defiant, had crumbled under the weight of resistance and time. All that remained in their grasp was Calais, a sliver of a past empire, clinging to the edge of a dream that had long since faded. Even that, too, would slip through their fingers a century later. What had begun as a dynastic claim ended as a harsh reminder. Ambition alone cannot hold a crown not shaped by the will of the people and the soil beneath their feet. But the war's legacy was carved far deeper than borders and banners. It rewrote the architecture of Europe's identity. In France, sovereignty was no longer a patchwork stitched by nobles. It became a fortress guarded by a centralized monarchy. The war had taught kings that control was not won in feasts and titles, but in loyalty, taxation, and arms. Towns once loyal to local lords now looked to Paris as the heart of order and power. Nationalism, still unnamed, had begun to pulse in the veins of farmers, merchants, and soldiers alike. Across the Channel, England faced a reckoning of its own. The loss of its continental holdings sparked not just mourning, but introspection. Who were they, if not a European empire? This crisis of identity would ripple into politics, economics, and eventually, civil war. The roses of Lancaster and York would soon bloom, watered by the blood of old wounds still fresh. Socially, the war fractured old norms and forged new ones. The feudal bonds that once defined medieval life loosened. Commoners, once footnotes in the epics of nobles, had carried longbows, stormed walls, and defended cities. They had bled for kings and country, and now demanded recognition. Economies that had once depended on the rhythms of agrarian peace were reshaped by the brutal necessities of prolonged conflict. Trade routes shifted, technologies advanced, and gunpowder, once a curiosity, became a cornerstone of military might. The clash of steel gave way to the boom of cannon, and with it, the very nature of power was reimagined. Culture, too, bore the scars and triumphs. Stories of heroes, martyrs, and fools filled the mouths of poets and chroniclers. The war had ended, but the age it ushered in was only beginning.